There are sermons in which the preacher has mastered the material, has polished the presentation, and is now sharing from their subject matter expertise. And then there are sermons like this one. What I've learned about conflict has mostly been learned the hard way in my coming up on 2 decades of parish ministry, and from a series of books that I read during and after those hard way experiences with titles like Church Fights, Managing Conflict in the Local Church, and Antagonists in the Church, How to Identify and Deal with Destructive Conflict. So today, as we reflect together on the value of conflict in beloved community, I do so out of a deep humility that comes from knowing I still have a whole lot to learn about this topic. As I begin, I want to offer one disclaimer. There was a congregational consultant, did a lot of work with Unitarian Universalists, may have been a Unitarian Universalist, I'm not sure, Speed Lees. He came up with, a long time ago, levels of congregational conflict, 1 through 5. Level 1 conflict is just a problem to be solved with folks being optimistic that things can work out. At level 3, the issue becomes a contest of wills, and someone's going to win and somebody's going to lose in level 3, but it's still possible for everybody to stick together after the resolution. By level 5, the groups have gathered into camps and are out to destroy one another, or at the very least to run one another out of town. Today, I'm talking mainly about those first few levels of conflict. People disagree, maybe about serious things, but they don't dehumanize the other person or group or overly personalize the fight. Folks are willing to stick around to work it out. That kind of conflict, those levels 1 through 3, maybe 4, aren't just something that happen every now and then but should be avoided at all costs. I would argue that that kind of conflict is part of the rich soil in which beloved community grows. We've been reflecting on beloved community as our monthly theme in May. And as a reminder, here's part of the definition. I've read this to you before if you've been here the past couple Sundays, of beloved community as written by some folks at the King Center. This is from the folks at the King Center. They say Dr. King's beloved community is a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. If we are serious about moving in that direction, and I know we are, and if we mean it when we talk about building democracy in our congregations and in society at large, and about making democracy an ever-expanding circle of inclusion, and I know we do mean that, then we are just going to disagree as a product of our natural diversity of thought and opinion. And those disagreements, if we use some skill and intention, can be really productive moments. As Speed Lees wrote, the optimum situation in a local church is not the absence of conflict, a situation where the church is apathetic and lacking in creativity, nor is it the situation where people are continually bickering and fighting and attacking. Rather, conflict well used and managed is present and is handled to energize and mobilize the people to initiate action and respond to needs they really care about in the congregation and its community. I like what George Bach wrote in his book, The Intimate Enemy. Conflict is a function of caring. If one doesn't care about the other person, one will not be motivated to be in conflict with them. Speed Lees told a great story to that effect. He said that one of the benefits of healthy conflict is that it helps people bear the unbearable. So as an example, he told a story of a group of folks who were absolutely incensed at their denomination's silence about the war in Vietnam, and they went about agitating for change. He said if it hadn't been possible for this group to confront its denomination, to make demands for change, try to organize church people to change their stand on this issue, these people wouldn't have stayed in the church. The very fact that they could challenge their denomination meant they would stay there and give it their support in other areas of their common life together. And that sounds pretty good. But this is not natural territory for me. Though through hard work and lots of opportunities for practice, I am getting better at it all the time. Maybe you don't feel completely at home with conflict either. Conflict has never been easy for me. I'm a Midwesterner. And we're taught that being nice is to be prized above all else. Just be nice, or that wasn't nice. Horrible thing to have said to you. I think it's fear-based. We internalize this message that if we disagree with people, especially in public, they might leave us forever. Of course, what ends up happening is that small disagreements get stored up, pressure building and building until there's a big blowout or a heart attack or some other physical symptom. Now, I've worked hard enough over the last couple decades so that now, every once in a while, I can realize what I'm thinking and not have to act on it. It will be the work of a lifetime, I know, especially for an extrovert. But sometimes I'm listening to somebody speak, and I really strongly disagree with them, but my impulse is to imply that I agree and get out of the conversation. Of course, Speed Lees, who's become an important mentor for me in this area, though I never met him, Speed Lees would tell me that's a terrible thing to do, especially if I'm in an important relationship with that person. Conflict can't be avoided. Better to think about how to keep the conflict productive than how to avoid it. So there are a few practices that I've learned, again, often the hard way, that help me stay in conflict without either giving up too much of myself, pretending I agree, or flying to anger. The first one is rooted deep in my spirituality as a novice modern-day Stoic practitioner. It's just true for a lot of us that conflict is scary. For me, it's especially scary when it's conflict in the congregation because you all pay for my groceries and my family and I like to eat. I asked Heather, is it okay if I say that? She said, I think it's okay. And there are all these congregational horror stories about how a congregation can just become embroiled in conflict and the minister becomes the central target, the central point of that conflict and is forced to leave. And so I've become scared before that I could lose my job because of big church fights. Here's where Stoic practice helps, and maybe it can help you too. Instead of trying to tamp down that fear, I've taken to following Seneca's advice and visualizing it in detail. Really living in the middle of it. What if I did lose my job, as unlikely as that might be? Well, nobody would die. We would need to move, but we've done that before. 12 times, actually. We might have to move to a smaller place, but we can do that too. In the very worst case, we have family who would let us live with them until we got back on our feet, and people do that all the time. Before long, I'm realizing how unlikely all this is, and how my mind is really blowing the whole deal just way out of proportion. There's something about, for me, fleshing out the worst-case scenario. This is what the Stoics taught, and I've experienced this. I think it helps. It can put tough situations into context. So much of our reactivity is rooted in the fearful projections of our minds. What could happen way down the line? So when we experience fear about conflict, maybe it can help to visualize the worst that could happen. Or maybe that one won't work for you. But here's another one that I think is super important. In conflict, stay curious. Rather than driving to prove the other side wrong, it's usually more fruitful to keep wondering, I don't feel that way at all. I wonder what leads you to feel that way. When I operate out of fear, it's almost impossible to stay curious. Fear drives us towards certainty, even if the certainty isn't justified, and certainty shuts down our curiosity. Like it did in a story from the book Getting to Yes by Roger Fisher and William Ury. I've adapted their story a little bit. Once there were two chefs working on different recipes for a big dinner for a big important leader. Of course, they were forced to share the same kitchen. Both were on tight deadlines. The dinner was in just a few hours, and they both needed an orange for their recipe. Here's the problem. There was only one orange in the kitchen, and no time to run out and buy another one. So the chefs, knives in hand, began yelling and gesturing wildly, "I need the orange! I need the orange!" And on they went, nearing blows a few times until one of them finally cut the orange in half. One of the chefs took his half and ran to the corner of the kitchen, squeezed out the juice, and finished his recipe. It wasn't quite enough juice, and the recipe wasn't quite right, but what could he do? It was all he had. The other chef grabbed his half of the orange too and sprinted to his side of the kitchen and began grating the peel of the orange for his recipe, which called for orange zest. And again, don't get ahead of me. It wasn't quite enough, and the recipe wasn't quite right. What was he going to do? It was all he had. For long years after, the two of them remembered the terrible feeling of looking over to the other's corner of the kitchen after the recipes were finished and realizing they could each have had what they wanted. False urgency, fear, anger, these things keep us from being curious, from staying in the conflict and learning where the other person's coming from. But when we can stay curious in conflict, we create a space for new paths to emerge, new ways of being together to become clear. And sometimes, not all the time, sometimes everybody can end up with what they need. So, visualize the worst that could happen if that helps. Stay curious, and importantly, stay in touch. When conflict gets to a certain point, it's tempting to cut off the other party, to create distance, stop talking to them, avoid them at all costs. And sometimes that's the right thing, it seems to me. We have to know, I think, when a situation has become toxic and intractable. We should give ourselves permission to get out of situations like that. But whenever it's possible, it helps so much to stay in touch with the other person. I've said before that can take a lot of forms. It might mean a monthly coffee or lunch appointment. Could mean just saying hi, hope you're well when you see the person and doing what you have to do to mean hope you're well. Or when things are really tense, it could be something a lot smaller. I just went to the beach and saw this seashell and know you're into seashells. Here's a seashell. Or here's a picture of a seashell. Whatever it is, staying in touch keeps the communication channels open, whereas cutting a person off, at least temporarily, closes off any path toward resolution. It might even, might even be the hardest on the person doing the cutting off. The truth is, probably you can't really cut the person off from you completely. Maybe you know the story of the young monk and the older monk who were traveling through the countryside. They came upon a woman who was trying to figure out how to cross a stream. She didn't know the area as well as the monks and hadn't prepared for the crossing. So the older monk, without saying a word, gestured to her that he would carry her across if she would like. She agreed, and he picked her up, carried her across the stream, and put her down again. She thanked him and went on her way. The younger monk walked on for some time, grumbling to himself about the older monk's decision. It clearly went against the rules of the order to touch another person in this way. It just wasn't to be done. How could any master do this? He groused to himself. This is completely unacceptable. And finally, he couldn't take it any longer. He said, "Master, what in the world were you thinking? How could you carry her across the stream that way?" And the master, never breaking stride, said, "You're still carrying her? I put her down on the other side of the stream." Not being around a person is no guarantee that we can put them down. When it's safe and feasible, Staying in touch is often the better option to guarantee that conflict can be productive, can resolve productively. And I think there's one more thing. When conflict has resolved, we do well when it's possible to celebrate together. Just as visualizing the worst that can happen might be helpful, so can remembering that there's coming a day, hard as it may be to see in the moment, where we can celebrate resolution together. That day can be the North Star that we use to guide us through productive conflict. Friends, we talk about and work on issues here that are deeply important to us, all the while going through the human experience of births and loves and griefs and deaths. Of course, we're going to experience conflict from time to time. But the truth is, beloved community requires some degree of conflict. So when it arises, let us not be afraid, but ready to stay in relationship and make our conflict productive. May it be so. Amen.